She didn't cry out. She didn't fall hard. But when Taini dropped to her knees in the dirt, face gray, body trembling, Eli Vance saw something he couldn't unsee. A woman like that doesn't go down easy. And when she does, it ain't from weakness. It's from something deeper, something eating her from the inside out. That moment, under the dying Arizona sun, Eli knew. She's not just tired. She's starving. And she's hiding something. The days ran long on Eli Vance's ranch, and he liked them that way. Dust in the boots, calluses in the palm. Those were marks of a man doing honest work. But that evening, as the shadows grew long and supper plates scraped empty, something was gnawing at him harder than usual. Taini. She wasn't like the others. Apache, soft-spoken, spine made of iron. She showed up before sunup and left after the last chore was done. Never once asked for more coin. Never once asked for help. But these past weeks, Eli had watched her whittle down to near nothing. The kind of thin you don't get from hard work alone. The kind that whispered of hunger that's been going on a while. Then came the bucket incident. She was carrying 2 heavy pails from the trough when her knees gave. Not from heat stroke. Eli had seen plenty of that. No, this was different. This was bone deep. Her hands shook as she tried to wave off help, muttering about being fine, about the sun. But Eli's gut said otherwise. That's why he rode out himself that night, wages in his pocket. Normally, he'd send his foreman. But tonight? Tonight he needed to look her in the eye. He found her alone in the cookhouse. The men had long since finished their meals, bellies full, headed for smokes and stories on the bunkhouse steps. But Taini was still there, moving quick, wrapping leftover food, bread, beans, cured pork, into cloth scraps with a quiet desperation that caught Eli's breath in his throat. He stepped inside, boots tapping the floor slow and deliberate. "Taini, got your pay." She spun around, nearly dropping a bundle. "Mr. Vance, I didn't hear you ride in." He handed her the money, but his eyes never left the sack she tried to hide with her foot. "You taking food home?" She nodded, but too fast. "Yes, just a few scraps for my son. Taza. You know how boys eat." "I noticed you didn't eat tonight." "Oh, I ate earlier." A beat. A lie. Eli didn't press it. He just leaned against the doorway, watching her hands tighten on the bag like it held her last hope. "How's Taza?" he asked. "He is well. I must go, Mr. Vance. I don't like leaving him alone after dark." "You walk?" "Every day." He frowned. Her camp was 4 miles off, through brush and sand. "You could have said something." "I prefer it. Clears my head." And just like that, she was out the door. Eli stood still for a long moment after she left. Then he moved. 10 minutes, that's what he gave her. Then he saddled his horse, took to the trail, and followed, quiet as a mountain cat. His hat pulled low, rifle slung, heart heavy with the weight of a suspicion he didn't want to believe. The sun slipped low behind the mesas, painting the land in bruised purples and dying gold. Taini never once looked back. She moved like a woman on a mission, and Eli's gut twisted tighter with each mile. She left the road, cut through scrub, slipped into the valley like a ghost. He tied his horse and followed on foot. What he found beyond that bend stole the air from his lungs. Not just a shack, not just a garden. A dozen children, dirty faces, hollow eyes, rags for clothes, huddled around a sputtering fire like pups in winter, and Taini, kneeling in the middle, pulling food from her sack, handing it out piece by piece. Eli crouched in the shadows, fists clenched. She kept nothing for herself. And when her boy Taza asked, "Mama, aren't you going to eat?" She lied, said she already had. told him to give his to the smallest girl. And he did. Eli looked away, jaw clenched so hard it hurt. He had seen plenty of pain, plenty of pride. But this? This was sacrifice. If that story stirred something in you, hit that subscribe button. There's more to come. Truths uncovered, choices made, and a community forever changed. Don't miss what happens next on the frontier. Eli Vance didn't sleep that night. Not because of coyotes, nor the busted fence on the South Range, nor the payroll due come Saturday. He didn't sleep because he couldn't shake the sight of that boy, Taza, splitting his own small supper in half without hesitation. Couldn't forget how Taini's voice had cracked when she'd told that lie, smooth as riverstone but hollow as a broken drum. I already ate, Hijo. Eli had seen men starve. He'd seen soldiers march on blistered feet with empty bellies and no hope. But he had never seen anyone starve themselves by choice. That kind of thing got under your skin, got into your bones, wouldn't let go. By dawn, his mind was made up. He wasn't going to bust in and play savior. He knew better. You come at a proud woman with a helping hand, she'll swat it away before you finish the gesture. No, this had to be careful, respectful, quiet. And it had to start with the truth. That evening, Eli waited by the cookhouse. The cowhands had long gone to the bunkhouse, belching and swapping lies after a hearty supper. The pots were scraped clean. The air smelled of soap and sweat and faint traces of burnt bacon. Taini stood over the basin, washing up with slow, methodical movements, like her thoughts were somewhere else. Maybe with the children. Maybe with the next day's firewood. Maybe with how to stretch a half loaf of bread into 12 bellies. Eli cleared his throat, stepping in. "Taini," he said, voice low. "Got a minute?" She turned, startled but composed. "Of course, Mr. Vance. Is something wrong?" "No," he replied. "Just wanted to pay you myself this time." He held out a small leather pouch. Her fingers hesitated before taking it. "Thank you." He didn't leave. Just stood there, leaning against the doorway, arms crossed. "I noticed you didn't eat again tonight," he said. "I already ate earlier," she replied, without missing a beat. Her voice didn't tremble. Her eyes didn't shift. But Eli had spent a lifetime reading horses and harder men. He knew when something bucked under the surface. "That sack you took home yesterday," he continued, casual as dust. "Wasn't just for Taza, was it?" She froze, just for a heartbeat, then wiped her hands on her apron. "I don't take more than I've earned," she said sharply. "That food was headed for mouths that need it. You got a problem with that? I'll leave come sunrise." Eli held up a hand. "No one's accusing you of a thing, Taini. You earn more than most, and you do it without complaint. But I can't pretend I don't see what's right in front of me." She stared at him hard, jaw set like carved stone. Then, after a long silence, she turned away. "I'm not looking for pity, Mr. Vance." "I know you're not," he said. "That's why I'm here talking to you like one adult to another. No charity, just truth." Her shoulders sagged ever so slightly. "I ain't got anyone," she murmured. "Not since my husband passed. Tribe turned their back on me. His people are all gone. That shack ain't worth the termites holding it up. But those children?" Her voice caught. "They come to me like they got nowhere else, and Lord help me, I can't turn them away." Eli nodded, quiet and respectful. "I followed you, Taini. Last night. I saw everything." She turned sharply, eyes wide with betrayal and fire. "You spied on me?" "I worried for you," he answered. "You were collapsing on my ranch. I had to know what was happening." She stared at him, and then she looked away. "Then you know I ain't got the strength to feed them much longer." "I know," Eli said. "And I also know you've got more backbone than 10 men. But that pride of yours is going to kill you if you don't let someone help." She didn't answer, just stood there, hands clenched, body still. "Finally," she said, barely above a whisper. "I can't be a beggar, Mr. Vance, not in front of my boy." Eli nodded again. "Then maybe we find a way to help. That ain't begging." She looked at him sideways. "I'm listening." He gave a small, slow smile, the kind a man wears when a plan starts to take shape in his gut. "Then we'll talk. Tomorrow, in my office. And what we talk about stays between us." Taini didn't smile back, but she gave a slow nod, eyes still wary but not quite closed anymore. And that was enough, for now. The next day passed slow as syrup and twice as heavy. Eli Vance couldn't focus worth a damn. His hands fixed fence posts, his eyes checked feed lines. But his mind? It trailed after Taini like a dust devil that wouldn't quit. She'd agreed to talk. That was something. But the look in her eyes last night, like a cornered wildcat, all pride and desperation, still clung to him like burrs on wool. Truth was, he didn't want to pry. He'd been raised with the belief that a man minds his own business. But hell, when a woman's wasting away under your roof and feeding a dozen children on scraps, it becomes your business. That's the burden of being in charge. You don't get to look away. So, when the sun dipped behind the ridge and painted the sky in blood and ash, Eli made his choice. He gave her a head start. 10 minutes by the ticking hands of his pocket watch. Then he saddled Dusty and took to the trail. He kept to the shadows, riding slow, the creak of leather and the soft thud of hooves muffled under twilight. The desert stretched quiet around him, save for the rustle of jackrabbits and the occasional coyote yip far off to the east. Taini didn't ride. She walked. That alone twisted something in his gut. 4 miles on foot after a full day's labor, and still carrying that heavy canvas sack slung over her shoulder like a cross. She never looked back. Never hesitated, like she'd walked this trail 100 times with her heart in her throat and fire in her heels. After a while, she veered off the main trail, past where most men turned back, into a dry wash littered with mesquite and jagged rock. Eli dismounted there, tied Dusty to a juniper snag, and followed on foot. The trail narrowed to a footpath, winding through brush and scrub oak. Moonlight spilled over the land in silver streaks, and the air turned colder the farther he went. Then he saw it. Through a gap in the trees, tucked into the crook of a rocky outcrop, stood a shack, if you could call it that. The thing looked like a strong gust might carry it off. The roof was patched with what looked like flour sacks and corrugated tin. One side leaned hard like a drunk against a wall. A small garden nearby, struggling to stay alive in the hard soil, was fenced with scavenged wood and old bedposts. But that wasn't what made Eli stop cold. No, it was the children, a dozen of them, maybe more, huddled around a low fire pit, silent and thin, eyes too old for their years. One boy had a bandaged leg. A girl with sun-bleached braids cradled a baby that wasn't hers. They all turned when Taini stepped into the light. And every one of them smiled. Not wild, happy grins, just small, worn smiles, like the kind you give when you know you're safe, if only for a moment. Eli crouched behind a boulder, heart thudding. He didn't move, didn't breathe. Taini opened her sack, pulling out bread, salt pork, a handful of beans. She worked quietly, efficiently, called each child by name, gave the oldest boy an extra strip of meat, slipped a biscuit to the smallest girl when she thought no one was looking. Then came Taza, her boy. Same dark eyes, same proud posture. He took his share without complaint. But what Eli saw next twisted his chest into a knot. Taini didn't keep a damn thing for herself. She handed out the last of the food, folded the cloths neatly, and sat down on a stump, empty-handed. Taza frowned. "Mama, why ain't you eatin'?" "I already ate, hijo," she lied. Smooth, gentle, practiced. Taza nodded, but Eli saw the doubt flicker in the boy's eyes. And then, without a word, he tore his biscuit in two and handed half to a little girl beside him. That was it. That was the moment Eli knew this wasn't just survival. This was a woman setting herself on fire to keep others warm. He backed away slow, heart pounding, fists clenched. He didn't want her to see him, didn't want to steal that small moment of dignity from her. By the time he reached Dusty and swung back into the saddle, the stars were out full, cold and bright above the valley. Eli didn't ride home. He raced, not from fear, but from purpose. Whatever line he might have thought he couldn't cross, he'd already crossed it. Taini wasn't just one of his workers. She was a lifeline to a dozen forgotten souls in this valley, and Eli Vance wasn't about to stand by and let her break. By the time Eli Vance made it back to the ranch, the moon had climbed high, casting ghost light over the valley. He didn't sleep. Not that night. Just sat on the porch with a cup of bitter coffee gone cold, watching shadows crawl across the land he owned. But all he could see was that shack, and those children. Taini hadn't just been feeding them. She'd become their whole world, their only world. He could still hear her voice in the dark, steady and warm as she handed out food, like it was the most natural thing in the world to give away what little you had. That wasn't just charity. That was love in its rawest form. The next morning he didn't tell a soul where he was going, didn't saddle Dusty or take his rifle, just filled his canteen, packed a side pouch with a few supplies, and took to foot. He needed to see it again. Needed to look it in the eye. The valley off the main trail wasn't meant for horses, anyhow. The path was narrow, overgrown in places, winding like a rattler through scrub and stone. When he reached the shack just past noon, the clearing was empty. No children, no fire, no sound but the creak of old wood and the whisper of the wind through brittle grass. He stepped closer. The shack looked even worse in the daylight. It was barely holding together. Patchwork walls, a door that hung off one hinge, and a roof stitched together with pieces of canvas, old metal signs, and tarp. A ragged blanket hung across a busted window, like a bandage trying to stop the bleeding. The air smelled of dust, rust, and faint wood smoke. Eli pushed the door open slow. Inside, the air was thick and close. The floor was hard-packed dirt. There was one cot in the corner, just wood slats and a straw mattress thin as a saddle pad. A small cast-iron stove stood cold in the corner, and next to it, a battered tin kettle and a few cracked enamel plates. No signs of luxury, no signs of waste, just survival. Then, behind the stove, he saw it. A neat stack of school books, some missing covers, others hand-stitched at the spine. Next to them sat a small leather-bound Bible with a broken spine and a tin box holding exactly 7 pencils. Worn down, sharpened to nubs. Taini wasn't just feeding those children. She was trying to teach them. Eli stepped back out into the sun, jaw tight. He walked the perimeter of the shack, noting everything. The half-dead garden, the makeshift chicken coop that had no chickens, and the small stone-lined well that barely held any water. He was halfway around when he saw the children again. They were coming from the south, quiet as ghosts. The oldest boy, maybe 13, carried a bundle of kindling. One girl held a dented pot filled with what looked like creek water. The rest had wild berries cupped in their hands or herbs tied in cloth, foraging, scavenging, scraping. They stopped when they saw him. Their eyes widened, not with fear exactly, but with wariness, like stray dogs who've learned not to trust boots or belts. Eli raised one hand. "I ain't here to hurt nobody," he said gently. "I work with Miss Taini." They said nothing, just stared. Then the door creaked open behind him. Taini. Her face was unreadable. Dark eyes locked on him like she already knew this was coming. "You shouldn't be here, Mr. Vance," she said flatly. "I know," he replied, "but I had to see it. All of it." A long silence stretched between them. The children shuffled past him, heading inside one by one without a word. Taini didn't move until the last one disappeared into the shadows. Then she stepped out, closing the door behind her. "You saw enough last night," she said. "I didn't see this," Eli countered. "This shack, these books, that garden." His voice tightened. "Taini, this ain't just a handout. You're building something, trying to make a future out of scrapwood and grit." She didn't deny it, didn't defend it, just crossed her arms, eyes hard. "They've got no one else." "I know, and now you don't either, not really. This place, it's fallen apart." Taini looked away. "I've tried." Eli nodded. "I know you have." Then softer. "You shouldn't have had to." What he saw that day carved a permanent scar across Eli's conscience. Not because he pitied them, but because he respected them. Because everything about that shack, the quiet dignity, the unspoken hunger, the firelight kindness, spoke louder than any sermon he'd ever heard. Taini had taken up a burden no one else wanted, and he wasn't going to let her carry it alone anymore. Eli Vance thought he'd seen the worst of it. He was wrong. That night, he returned. Not as a rancher checking up on a worker, but as a man tethered to a truth he could no longer ignore. He stayed hidden again, crouched behind the same rise of boulders, the desert wind whispering low like it knew a secret. The fire was already lit when he arrived, flickering soft in the center of the clearing. It painted the children in gold and shadow, eyes bright, cheeks hollow. They gathered instinctively, forming a line not out of discipline, but habit. They knew the drill. Taini moved among them like a mother fox guarding a den. Her hands moved quick and sure, unwrapping cloth bundles, dividing what little she had. Bread, pork, beans, a few slices of apple from who knows where. It wasn't enough for one meal, let alone 12. But somehow, she made it enough. She smiled, encouraged, brushed hair out of dirty faces, tucked slices of bread into tiny palms like it was communion. Eli watched every bit of it in silence. And then came the part he couldn't take, Taza. He was near the end of the line that night, waiting quietly like he always did. When his turn came, Taini handed him the smallest portion of all, a scrap of bread, a sliver of meat, a spoonful of beans. "Here, mihijo," she said softly. "Mama?" the boy asked, brow furrowed. "You haven't eaten." "I ate at the ranch," she lied. "Had more than I needed." It was the same lie, practiced, smooth, worn like river stone. Eli could almost hear the crack in her voice, now that he knew what to listen for. Taza didn't argue. He just looked at her a second too long, then did something that burned itself into Eli's chest like a brand. He turned to the girl beside him. Sadie, maybe 6 years old, wearing a man's shirt tied at the waist, and broke his biscuit in two. "Here," he said. "You can have some of mine." The little girl blinked, then smiled. The kind of smile a child gives when they've forgotten what kindness feels like. Taini turned her face away. Just for a second. But Eli saw it, saw the tear slide down her cheek and vanish in the dirt at her feet. She wiped it quick, pulled her shawl tighter around her bones, and went on pretending everything was fine. That was it. That was the moment Eli Vance cracked wide open. He stood up, stepped back, and walked out of that clearing like a man walking away from a funeral. Not theirs, his own. Because what he'd buried that night was the last excuse. The last bit of distance he'd allowed himself to feel between her struggle and his responsibility. Taini was dying. And not from sickness or violence or some act of God. She was dying because she'd decided to feed the hungry instead of herself. And he, Eli Vance, had been letting her. He rode back under a moon as bright and unforgiving as a lantern in a jailhouse. The wind was bitter. The land too quiet. His thoughts loud enough to echo off the canyon walls. All the money he had, all the cattle, the acres, the men working under his brand. None of it meant a damn thing if this was happening under his nose. He hadn't been blind. He'd just been comfortable. And comfort makes cowards of most men. But not anymore. When he got back to the ranch, he didn't pour a drink, didn't light his pipe, didn't sit. He walked straight into the study, pulled out a blank ledger, and started scribbling. Not just numbers, plans, a new job, a house, a way to help that didn't look like charity, a way to preserve her pride and save her life at the same time, because she'd given enough. And it was time someone gave back. The sky hadn't yet turned blue when Eli Vance stepped into the saddle. He rode out while the desert still slept. No breakfast, no coffee, just a tight jaw and a direction. His hat brim low, his eyes sharper than the chill in the morning wind. He wasn't riding to check fence lines. He was riding for answers. He needed to know just how deep the hole Taini was in. Because now that he'd seen what she was hiding, now that he'd watched her break off slivers of supper for a dozen forgotten souls while her own ribs showed through her dress, he couldn't pretend anymore. And if he was going to help, it had to be real. Clean. No pity, no handouts. The kind of help a proud woman wouldn't spit on. His first stop was Hattie Greer's Mercantile. Hattie had run that store longer than Eli had owned the land he sat on. If a grain sack so much as shifted in Red Creek Valley, Hattie heard it hit the floor. She looked up when the bell over the door rang. "Well, I'll be. You're up early, Mr. Vance." "I'm looking for the truth, Hattie, about Taini." The smile faded from her lips. She stepped around the counter, wiped her hands on her apron, and gave him a long look. "What kind of truth?" "The kind she won't tell me," Eli said. "How bad is it?" Hattie hesitated, but only for a breath. "She's been living off scraps. Comes in once a week, sometimes twice, buying the barest of supplies, flour, salt, maybe some dried beans. No coffee, no meat, no eggs." Eli felt his chest tighten. "She ever ask for credit?" "She did. I gave it when I could. But it's gone dry now, and she won't ask again. Too proud." Hattie's voice softened. "Last month she tried to trade me her wedding ring." Eli's jaw clenched. "You take it?" "I refused. Told her I wasn't that hard up, but I ain't seen her wear it since." He nodded slowly, jaw working. "You see her with those kids?" Hattie's face changed again. Went quieter. "I've seen her share her bread out behind the store. Never made a fuss of it. Thought maybe a nephew or two. But I knew better." She crossed her arms, eyes locking with his. "That woman is feeding half the lost souls in this valley, Eli, out of her own hand, and it's killing her." Next stop, Doc Amos. The old man still had his coffee mug in hand when Eli stormed in, boots dusty, face carved from stone. "Doc," Eli said, I need the truth about Taini. Doc didn't even blink. Can't discuss patience, Eli. You know that. She collapsed on my ranch a week ago, Eli growled. That makes her my concern. The doc leaned back, studied him a moment, then nodded. She came in weeks ago, said she was tired, dizzy, couldn't keep food down. I asked her what she'd been eating. He sighed. Not much. He set the mug down with a thud. She's severely malnourished. She's not just tired, she's starving. Organs slowing down. If it keeps up, she'll go to sleep one night and not wake up. Eli ran a hand down his face. Why didn't she say anything? Doc gave him a look. You already know why. Same reason you didn't ask last month when she started looking like a shadow. Eli took that one square in the chest. Doc continued. She's been given most of her food to that boy, and the rest to whoever else is needing. That's why she's fading. And Taza, he's sick too. Every illness that floats through town, that boy catches it. No immune system left. Eli turned, gripping the doorknob so hard the brass squealed. Put her care on my tab, he muttered. Her and the boy, and don't you dare tell her it's charity. I figured as much, Doc said quietly. She won't hear it from me. Eli stepped back into the morning light a different man than he'd been the night before. He wasn't just disturbed. He was angry. At the world. At the silence. At himself. He rode back with a plan already forming, real, permanent, and disguised as opportunity. Because if pride was the wall Taini built around herself, he'd have to go through the door, a legitimate job, a roof that didn't leak, a future she could call her own. And by God, he would make it look like business. Eli Vance wasn't a man given to scheming. But this wasn't scheming. This was strategy, shaped not by pride, but by respect. He couldn't just hand Taini a sack of money. Couldn't march up to that shack with bags of grain and say, Here, I fixed it. That would shame her more than the hunger ever had. No, if he was going to help her, it had to look like something else. It had to be something else. He rode into the ranch yard late morning, gravel crunching under Dusty's hooves. Silas Croft, his wiry foreman, was already at the corral, fixing a split rail with the kind of no-nonsense rhythm that matched Eli's own temperament. Eli swung down from his saddle. See, he called out, voice level. Need a word. Silas gave a grunt, wiped his hands, and followed Eli towards the tack shed. When Eli spoke again, it wasn't with hesitation. It was with the certainty of a man who knew exactly what he was about to do. I want you to buy the old foreman's cottage, the one just past Miller's Creek. Silas blinked. That place ain't fit for coyotes. Then we'll fix it. Silas gave him a long look. You setting up another bunkhouse? No, Eli said. I'm creating a new job. Full-time cook, salary, lodging included. Silas raised an eyebrow. Thought Mrs. Dale had that under control. She's part-time. This is different. A proper cookhouse by the cottage. Something quiet, close to the main road, easy access, and make it look official, like the ranch is expanding. Silas crossed his arms. This got anything to do with the Apache woman? Eli didn't flinch. She's feeding orphans out of a shack held together by wind and prayers. She's dying on her feet to keep 'em alive. We owe her more than thanks. Silas gave a short nod, slower this time. That's a fine kind of trouble to have, I reckon. Eli softened. And I need it done quiet. Pride's a hell of a thing. Make sure it looks like I'm hiring her for her skill, not out of charity. Silas nodded again, the respect growing behind his usual gruffness. You got it, boss. I'll get Finch's boys to start working on the roof. We'll have it patched and whitewashed in a week. Over the next days, Eli moved like a man with a secret map and a ticking clock. Supplies were brought in under other names. New beds, a proper iron stove, curtains, pots, pans, shelves lined with flour, beans, coffee, even candy sticks tucked into the corner for Taza. He sent word to the Shaw brothers about the children, hard men with soft hearts, both of whom had grown up one step from hungry themselves. Then to Old Man Cole, who ran the feed store and had once buried 3 of his own grandkids from sickness. Together they set up something simple, honest, quiet, a children's fund, something that looked on the outside like a business initiative, shared community investment, ranchers pooling a few dollars to support those in the cracks of Red Creek Valley. But under the surface, it was more than money. It was protection, a net for the forgotten. By week's end, the cottage stood tall again. The roof no longer leaked. The walls didn't groan when the wind blew. There was a stove hot enough to keep a dozen bellies warm. And all it needed now was a matron. One with a backbone like iron and a heart soft enough to make soup out of nothing. Eli stood outside the door, his hat in hand, dust on his boots, rehearsing the words in his head. He wouldn't mention the orphans, wouldn't mention the shack. He'd offer a job, a real job. Because folks like Taini didn't need saving. They needed someone to believe they were worth investing in. The morning sun hung low over Red Creek Valley, painting the hills with a dusty gold. Eli Vance stood on the porch of the newly repaired cottage, arms crossed, hat tucked beneath one elbow, boots firm on the boards he'd personally helped lay down. A curl of smoke puffed lazily from the chimney. Inside, the stove had already been lit. All that was left now was for her to see it. He watched the trail, heart thudding low and steady like a war drum. Dust swirled in the distance, then came the shape of a lone rider, Taini, her dark braid trailing behind her like a rope of ink. She dismounted slowly, suspicious eyes flitting from the repaired roof to the rocking chair Eli had whittled smooth himself. "What is this?" she asked flatly, lips pressed tight. Eli didn't dodge. "A job, a real one. Cooking full-time for the ranch. Comes with a place to live and your own keys." She stepped closer, eyes narrowing. "You followed me." He met her gaze, steady as bedrock. "Yeah, I did." Her jaw worked, anger, shame, suspicion all boiling under the surface. She turned away from the porch, as if about to mount her horse again. "You think I need charity?" she snapped over her shoulder. "No," Eli said softly. "I think you need a fair deal, and I aim to offer one." Inside the cottage, Taini moved like a ghost, touching every surface as though it might vanish beneath her fingers. Her son Taza followed, wide-eyed, running to the tiny bookshelf stacked with primers and arithmetic readers. "There's books," he whispered. "There's a future," Eli murmured from the doorway. Taini didn't speak, but her shoulders trembled. Eli stepped inside and took off his hat. He wasn't about to crowd her, but she needed to know this wasn't some fluke. Wasn't some passing kindness. This was permanent. "I was 10 when my mama nearly starved to death," Eli began, voice low and gravel-worn. "It was a winter so mean it cracked stone. My old man died in a mine collapse, and she didn't have no one. No money, no kin, just me and a little sister. Barely born." Taini turned toward him, expression softening. "There was a man named Cyrus Holt. He brought us food without asking for thanks. Said a man with full pockets ain't worth a damn if he don't use 'em to pull someone else up. That stuck with me." He stepped closer now, placing a folded envelope on the kitchen table. "That's your first week's wages. The rest's in the bank, where it'll keep growing. Rent's covered. You'll have what you need and then some." Her fingers touched the envelope, but didn't take it. "I didn't ask for help," she said. "I know," he said, then added with a small smile. "But I did." She sat down slowly in the rocking chair and looked out the window, where the wind blew through the cottonwoods and the scent of coffee wafted from the stove. I don't want folks looking at me like I'm weak, she said. You ain't, Eli replied. You're the strongest person I know. Her eyes welled then, and she blinked fast, refusing to let the tears fall. And this ain't a favor, he added, kneeling slightly to her level. It's good business. My boys need feedin', and you've already proven you know how to stretch a pot farther than any cook I ever met. Her lips twitched, the beginnings of a smile. You got a deal, Mr. Vance, she said quietly. He rose, tipped his hat, and said, Welcome home, Miss Taini. The sun was dipping low when Eli Vance returned to the cottage. He brought a sack of flour, a jar of preserves, and a repaired pair of Taza's boots slung over his shoulder. He didn't knock, just stepped onto the porch, slow and respectful, like a man coming home to a place that wasn't quite his. Inside, Taini stood over the stove, ladling stew into bowls. The smell of cumin and beef filled the air. Taza was on the floor with his books open, lips moving silently as he read. You're early, she said without turning. I didn't want to be late, Eli replied, setting the goods on the counter. Taini wiped her hands on a worn cloth and faced him. Her eyes were calm, but there was a storm beneath them. She folded her arms. You followed me that night. Eli nodded once. I did. She swallowed hard. You had no right. No, he said, but I had a reason. She sat down slowly at the table, her spine stiff with pride, chin lifted. You saw the others? I saw everything. There was a long silence between them, filled only by the soft clink of Taza's pencil tapping the wood floor. Eli finally lowered himself into the chair opposite hers, elbows on the table. I know you think I stepped over a line, he said, voice thick with quiet grit. And maybe I did, but I couldn't sleep knowing one of my own was wasting away right under my nose. I'm not yours, she replied, not cruelly, just plainly. I reckon that's true, he said, then added gently, but I wanted you to be. Her breath caught. For a second, something raw passed between them. Something that wasn't about charity or hunger or debt. I lied to my son, she whispered. Told him I wasn't hungry while my belly burned like fire. I know. And still he gave half his supper to Sadie. Eli nodded. That's how I knew. She looked away then, blinking fast. Her jaw tightened like she was chewing down a sob. There's a piece of me that's still in that valley shack, she admitted. Still listening for coyotes, still counting bites, still waiting for the sound of boots that might take it all away. Eli took off his hat and laid it on the table between them, like a man laying down his weapon. I've been there too, you know, he said. Taini glanced up, surprised. You ever heard of Cyrus Holt? She shook her head. Most haven't. He was a drifter, a rough hand with a broken back and a bigger heart. Fed my family for 2 months after my pa died. Never asked for thanks. Never came back. But I swore if I ever had the means, I'd be that man for someone else. Taini's gaze lingered on him now, softening. We ain't meant to carry all this weight alone, Eli said, even when we think we got the strength. She stared at him a long beat. Why me? Because you didn't fold. You kept going. For your boy, for the others. You broke yourself to keep them whole. Her lip quivered, and this time she didn't hide the tears. They spilled over, fast and hot. I didn't want you to see me like that, she whispered. I didn't want you to have to live like that, he replied. Later that evening, after supper, Taini stepped outside to find the stars had come out. The valley stretched beneath them like a dark ocean, and the lights from the ranch glowed warm and golden in the distance. Eli stood nearby, one boot propped against a post, arms crossed, quiet as the night. She didn't say a word, just stepped beside him, shoulder brushing his. And for the first time in a long, long while, she didn't feel alone. 6 months passed like the last breath of winter melting into a stubborn spring. Red Creek Valley, once known for dust and drought, had bloomed with something far rarer than rain. It started small. A fence was mended. A chimney was patched. Then came the trucks, hauling lumber down the dirt road, the clamor of hammers and the smell of fresh sawdust filling the morning air. Not for a barn, not for a saloon, for something the valley had never seen before, a real home for forgotten children. They called it the Hearth House. Built from the hands of folks who once minded only their own herds and fields, the home stood tall on a ridge near the ranch. Not flashy, but strong. Not perfect, but honest. And at the center of it all was Taini, her back straight, her voice firm, and her eyes softer now, like she'd finally found ground that didn't shift under her feet. The children from the valley no longer slept on dirt floors or shared crusts by firelight. They had bunk beds, warm meals, books, and a routine shaped by dignity. Taza thrived under the roof his mother helped build. He was top of his school now, running with a pack of boys and girls who no longer flinched at the sound of boot heels. Taini had traded secrecy for stewardship. Every morning she rang the bell that called the children to breakfast. Every night she sat with the youngest by their beds, humming soft Apache lullabies that drifted through the open windows like smoke. And Eli Vance? He never spoke much about what he'd done. Didn't want thanks, didn't ask for praise. But anyone who looked close could see the change. The hard lines in his face had softened. He spent more time leaning on fences, watching the children play in the distance, than he did counting cattle. The ranch still ran, of course. Business was good. But Eli had found a deeper kind of wealth. The kind that couldn't be weighed or fenced. The kind built from second chances and silent reckonings. One cool September afternoon, a letter arrived in Eli's mailbox. The return address was scrawled in block letters, C. Holt, Montana. Eli read it twice, then folded it carefully and tucked it into his coat pocket. That night, as he walked past the cottage where it all began, he saw Taini on the porch, sewing under the amber porch light. He paused. "You remember I told you about Cyrus Holt?" he asked. She looked up. "The drifter who fed your family?" Eli nodded. "Turns out he's still kicking. Says he read about the Hearth House in the Gazette. Sent me a letter." "What did it say?" Eli smiled, slow and humble. Said he was proud to know I paid it forward. Taini returned the smile, and for a moment neither spoke. The quiet between them was full, like a valley after the rain. Later that week, the whole town gathered for the first Red Valley Harvest Festival. There were pies, fiddles, sack races, and a ribbon cutting at the Hearth House. Kids who'd once hidden behind Taini's skirts now ran barefoot in the grass, faces sticky with honey and laughter. And when the sun dipped low behind the hills, painting the sky in gold and rust, Eli stepped up to say a few words. He wasn't a man for speeches, but he cleared his throat and looked out at the crowd. "I used to think a man's worth was measured in cattle, in acres, and how long his name stuck to a sign," he began. "But turns out the best thing I ever did wasn't about land. It was about people, about not looking away when someone needed help." He glanced at Taini, then at the children. "We build fences to keep our stock in, but maybe it's time we started building doors too, so folks can walk through when they're cold, hungry, or lost." The crowd didn't clap right away. They just stood there, quiet, many with tears in their eyes. Then, one by one, they started to applaud. Not just for Eli, but for what the valley had become. When the last lantern was doused and the kids were tucked in bed, Eli rode out alone beneath the stars. He stopped by the old trail that once led him to that broken shack. It was overgrown now, forgotten by most. But Eli remembered. He touched the brim of his hat and whispered, "Thank you, Cyrus," into the wind. "Now it's your turn, friend. What do you think truly defines a person's worth? Is it land, money, pride? Or is it how they show up, quietly, fiercely, for those with nothing left? If this story stirred something in your heart, don't write off just yet. Subscribe now so you don't miss the next tale that proves the Wild West still has lessons left to teach.